Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to this webinar on how to prethink assumptions. My name is Rajat Sudana. I'm one of the co-founders of e-GMAT, and I'm going to be a main host today. Supporting me in this webinar, we have Sandeep. Sandeep is a GMAT strategy expert, and he'll make sure that all your questions in this webinar are answered. Uh, it's a fairly application-focused webinar. In this webinar, we focus on that process of pre-thinking, and to make sure that you have the right kind of background, we did send a few video lessons your way. The two most important video lessons were, let me just see if I can draw on this. The two most important video lessons were, one was Introduction to Assumption, the other one was Pre-thinking Logical Gap. Other than that, the other video lessons which cement this process of pre-thinking are the pre-thinking two entities, and there's another one which is there in your free trial. If you've not gone through these video lessons, then I would very strongly recommend that you go through them post this webinar. Okay, let me hide this. Also, we have a few upcoming free webinars. We have a free webinar on GMAT algebra tomorrow. This webinar is hosted by Payal Tandon, and if you're looking to score a Q49, Q50, or a Q51, and if algebra is one area where you face issues, then you should definitely attend this one. In this webinar, we talk about a single unified approach using which you can solve the easiest to the most challenging questions in GMAT algebra. And this is only if you know the basic formulas and have a good understanding of it. On the other hand, if you feel you have a good understanding of it, if you want to, and you can solve questions in algebra, and if you want to challenge yourself, I would definitely attend that second part of this webinar when we go to the most challenging questions. So in this webinar, we start with the easiest and the foundational concepts in algebra and slowly progress from 600 to 650 to 700 level questions, all the while using the same unified method. Then we also have a GMAT strategy webinar, which is next Saturday, a week from now. In this, we do three things. One is we really talk about what we call as that 99th percentile mindset. We really say, hey, what is it that you need to do to score that 99th percentile? How should you think about structuring your study plan? Then we talk about when you study, what should you focus on, so that when you take assessments, you get to a high score. And then we look at how can you track your improvement, not just while taking the mocks over here, but also from the very beginning when you are studying. So three-part webinar really essential for those who are looking to score high on the GMAT. So this is a free webinar. It's very heavily attended. I have about 150 students in the webinar, and to make sure that we make this useful to this group as a whole, we ask a few leading questions. One of them is, when do you plan to take the test? The second one's, what's your target GMAT score? So when do you plan to take the test? Given the season, that cycle that we are in, which is um, that round one is about I'd say a month and a few days away. If you look at Harvard, or a month and a couple of weeks away. If you look at the later on deadlines, more I think like GSP Chicago and so on and so forth. So what we see is a fairly even mix. We have a few folks who are taking the test right away, a significant number who have between 16 to 30 days. We also have a significant number who between 46 to 75 days before their test. Then a small group of people who haven't taken a date as of yet. Then let's look at the target GMAT scores over there. The 730 to 750 bracket, the most popular bracket. Almost majority, or actually almost majority of those who have chosen to respond to fall in that bracket. And then the other two brackets next to it, 710, 720, as well as 760 plus, also fairly popular. Now, there's no right score anywhere. I would just say this. I think what's important over here is to understand what you're aiming for and put in the effort accordingly. If you're aiming for a 710, 720, understand that you are aiming for something that's above 90th percentile, and study accordingly. If you're aiming for that 760 score, understand that you're aiming for a 99th percentile or better, and study accordingly. Put in that effort, stay focused accordingly. Okay, with that, let's go into the webinar pane. The screen will have changed for you, or will be in the process of changing for you. Depending on which part of the world you're joining from, it can take anywhere between 15 to 45 seconds for the screen transition process to get done. I'm going to give you guys another 10 to 15 seconds um, for this to transition. And let's put in a poll question to see if each one of you can really see CR1 pre-thinking for assumptions. Select yes if you can, select no otherwise. All right, it seems pretty much everyone can see that. That's wonderful. Okay, I see so below the presentation mode, you see the Q&A part. If you have a question that's relevant to what we're talking about, definitely put that question in the Q&A part. So essentially, there are three parts of this webinar. In the first part, we're going to give a brief introduction to e-GMAT. That's going to last about 12 minutes. In the second part, we're going to get into the core of this webinar, and that's going to be about 120 minutes. And then in the third part, we're going to have an open-ended a Q&A for questions that have not been answered so far. Just 1 second. Okay, so again, while we are in the first and second part, and let me just draw this just so that I can put that focus. While we are in this first part or in this second part, I recommend, just so that we stay on track, yeah, that we keep the questions relevant to what's being talked about. And then when we get to this third part of this webinar, which is this open-ended Q&A, I'd be happy to answer any question that you have, whether it's pertaining to GMAT Verbal, GMAT Quant, your overall applications, or your career choices post your MBA. Okay. With that, let's go right into the first part of this webinar, which is an introduction to e-GMAT. So early on, I asked this question: what's your target GMAT score? And upwards of 60% of you wanted to get to a score of 720 or higher. And while that's the case, only 6% of the students get to that score of 720 or higher. And this is despite the fact that median scores at top B schools continue to go up. In fact, there was a report that at Stern there was a further increase. The status from 2018, but there was a report recently that at Stern there has been a further increase recently. So what is it that people who get to these scores do? A good percentage of them do use e-GMAT. Now, why do we say that? When you look at the stats on key forms, one is the number of verified reviews. The second is a number of success stories. What you're going to find is that e-GMAT accounts for more than half of the verified reviews on major forums, as well as it accounts for more than half of the success stories on GMAT Club's Share GMAT Experience forum. Now, what is it that makes our students more successful than students from other prep companies? I think if there's one thing that distinguishes us from or our course offerings from those from other prep companies, it is our approach to GMAT preparation, or how we think about the architecture of learning that we provide. So when you think about the architectures of learning, there are two architectures of learning that are prevalent today. One is what we call as the book-based architecture, and the second is the private tutoring-based architecture. Now, when you look at most of the online courses out there, whether they provide audio-visual instruction or not, what you're going to find is that the core learning architecture that they offer is this book-based architecture. And when you map e-GMAT's offerings with the technology architecture combined to one of these two architectures, what you're going to find is that we are much more aligned to this private tutoring-based approach. And to understand that, let's kind of understand, how do you get to that 720 or higher score? So if you want to get to that 720 or higher score, the first thing you need to do is based on your strengths and weaknesses, you need to create this efficient path towards the goal. Then you need to learn the concepts that you don't know already. Then you need to, just knowing the concepts isn't enough. You also need to know how to apply those concepts to solve questions successfully. And while doing that, you need to get so good that you attain a level of mastery that puts you in that top 6 percentile of, and forgive my handwriting, top 6 percentile of users who take the test. As long as you can do that, you can get to that 720 score. So let's see how a book-based approach approaches this problem. Now, A book-based approach is all about autonomy. What it really means is that, when you study using a book, you get a couple of study plans and you have to choose one of those study plans. Then you start learning concepts and a number of books that will teach you concepts very well. The problem really is they won't verify whether you've learned the concept well enough. So when 1,000 people go through the book, they learn to 1,000 different degrees, and that onus of or burden of validation remains with the student. One area where books don't do as great a job of is teaching you how to apply those concepts. Uh, you know, it's very difficult just in that static architecture of book to tell you, hey, to solve this problem, do this in step one, step two, and step three. And if you falter, to tell you which step did you falter at and why possibly did you falter. And so people who resort to this book-based approach, they solve hundreds and hundreds of questions, and only the best and the brightest, the most diligent ones are able to master application. And when it comes to evaluating whether you are among those top 6 percentile of students or not, uh, what people who go through a book-based approach do is they take a ton of mock tests and to do that. And again, even when you take a mock test, that onus of evaluation is completely on the student. A private tutoring based architecture works slightly differently. When you work with a good private tutor, would create a personalized study plan that's takes into account your strengths and weaknesses and allocates enough time so that you can leverage your strengths and overcome your weaknesses. Then a good private tutor also gives you feedback on the concepts that you need to learn. One area where a private tutoring based architecture makes a huge difference is when it comes to teaching you application of concepts. A good private tutor will tell you what you need to do in step 1, 2, and 3, and as you falter, a private tutor would explain where you need to focus your energy on. And while you're solving questions, a good private tutor will constantly evaluate your extent of mastery, and as you get to that top 6 percentile or top 1 percentile, whatever you're aiming for, a good private tutor would move you from one topic to the other. So while you learn the same content, the extent of personalization, the extent of feedback, the extent of application is a lot more in this private tutor based approach. And you can really see why it's a lot more successful. So let's see why is it that we say that most of the courses out there follow this book-based approach, whereas e-GMAT follows this private tutor-based approach. We're going to start with that step 1, which is defining that path to the goal. So how do you define a customized path to the goal if you're going to go from that score of 600, which is what we're going to take as a baseline case, to a score of 720? And again, the process remains the same regardless of whether you're starting at a 650 or a 550 or whether you're aiming for a 700 or a 760. So how do you go about creating a personalized study plan? The first step you need to do is you need to figure out what your abilities are. So your GMAT score is a test of 5 different abilities. You need to quantify your starting abilities. Then you need to figure out, hey, what do you need to improve these abilities to get to that 720 or 760? Okay. And then, depending on your starting abilities and your ending abilities, you need to really say, hey, do you need to study all of SE? Do you need to study all of CR? Do you need to study all of number properties? Or do you just need to focus on refinement and enhancement of your learning? And so you personalize your course according to delta between your starting abilities and your milestones over here. So this delta allows you to personalize your course. So how do you quantify your starting abilities? The only mock test in the world that gives you these abilities is a Sigma X mock. The only other way to get these abilities today is to take an actual GMAT exam and to order your ESR, which, by the way, overall costs $280. So you can get this on the e-GMAT website free of charge, or you can basically take an actual test and then order an ESR to get your starting abilities. Then how do you define those milestones, which is your target milestones that will help you get to a 760 score? We've created a tool called GMAT Planner that has multiple neural networks in there that allows each one of you to build your target milestones. And here is how GMAT Planner looks. It'll take in your starting quant and verbal scores. It'll take in the components that make in the Q48 and the V28. And based on that, it'll tell you not just a target quant and a target verbal score that you need to aim for to get to that 720 score, but it'll also tell you how should you get to a Q50. So it'll tell you your target arithmetic and algebra geometry abilities and the abilities in SCCR and RC that you should aim for. Now, these abilities are customized based on your starting abilities, and so are these. And it has three neural networks running into it that create the shortest path, most likelihood path to that 720 score. So when you do that, your study plan is not a black box in which you're just studying. It becomes a set of 5 neatly defined milestones in which you're going from this starting score in arithmetic to this ending score in arithmetic, or this starting score in sentence correction to this ending ability in sentence correction. It then creates an estimated timeline for you. So this is, you know that you're going to start with arithmetic and then you're going to spend about a week and a half studying arithmetic. And your goal should be to get to that 83rd percentile. And then, you're going to go through this process. In critical reasoning, you're going to need a dedicated set of almost 2 weeks over here. And so you can really visualize your prep overall. And this is all done for you free of charge. So when you do this, your personalized GMAT preparation is divided into a set of 5 milestones. If you hit those milestones, you can be very certain that you can hit your target GMAT score. Now, beyond that, it also creates a day-by-day plan for you based on how much time can you spend during the weekdays and how much time can you spend during the weekends. And you can really put in the start date, you can put in the end date. If you have any holidays, you can really add those holidays over here as well. And it'll tell you, hey, it'll adjust all of this and tell you when can you actually take the test. So why did we spend upwards of 1,000 hours building this utility? It wasn't easy to build something like this, but because we built this, each one of you can create that in 7 minutes or fewer. And right now, about 7,000 odd study plans have been created using this utility. Now, this was just the first part, which is, hey, creating a study plan. A good private tutor, after creating that study plan, also teaches you concepts and gives you feedback that's personalized to you. Our technology architecture is built around this philosophy. What you really see over here is you have these video lessons. This is a video icon over here. And within each video lesson, you have its own personalized assessment, which gives you feedback that's personalized to you. The time that you see over here is the time that you spent on it. Also, there's a state over here where you can click on this state and really, if you want to revise certain video lesson, you can really say, hey, I want to mark it for revision for later on. Okay. Now, if you compare this to another online course, which also has audio-visual lessons, this is a popular course by Magoosh, what you really see is it looks very differently. You have certain lessons in subject verbs. It's not as comprehensive. There's no assessment. This time that you see is not the time that you spent on this lesson. It's the length of the video. Now, after teaching you concepts, a good private tutor also teaches you how to apply those concepts and to make sure that when you see a problem, what you need to do in step 1, step 2, and step 3. Within the e-GMAT offering, we have this specific file called an application file in which we do this. And in a particular course, we have upwards of 20 such files. So you'd see a file in subject verb, you'll see a file in verbs, you'll see a file in pronouns, you'll see multiple files in modifiers, parallelism, comparison. So you'd see about 3 to 4 files each in these modules. So depending on the length of the module, we do that. Then we not only teach you how to approach a problem, we evaluate your ability to apply that problem right then and there. And then we also give you a select set of OG questions in which we evaluate your ability. And this is how every module is architected, whether it's a quant module or a verbal module. And you compare this to the Magoosh offering, again, you have this quiz, which is common not just to subject verb, but also to auxiliary verbs as well as pronouns. Again, you don't see that score. The intent is not to give you feedback, but just to give you practice. So then the last piece of this puzzle is, you learn, you have a study plan, you learn concepts, you learn how to apply them. How do you figure out whether you've hit that 90th percentile, 95th percentile, or so on and so forth? And to do that, we have created an assessment tool called Scholarium, which has what we call as ability quizzes. So you can take an SC ability quiz and it'll give you an ability score. Then it has what we call a skill data, which will tell you when you have that 76 percentile ability, what is your ability in several subcomponents in sentence correction. So the beauty of this is you can really say that the reason why this guy hasn't gotten that 98th percentile is because he lacks in comparison. So you can go back to the comparison module and you can learn those concepts again and come back, take another ability quiz. So you can do this round tripping within a day and really see how much you've improved. So now you can really see why we say that most of the other courses are built around this book-based architecture, whereas e-GMAT's built around this private tutoring-based architecture. Now, who's created some of these courses? 4 out of some of GMAT Lab's top-rated instructors have created these courses. Instructors who, on an average, are reviewed a lot more frequently on GMAT Club. So you can see why we say that while only 6% of the people get to that 720 or higher score, a good number of them do use e-GMAT. If you want to stay connected with all things e-GMAT, if you want to stay connected with most things that are going on in a B-School world, I'd recommend that you connect with me on my LinkedIn. I have upwards of 12,500 students who are connected with me on my LinkedIn. You'd also be able to connect with admission officers at top B-Schools and as well as some of the world's top admission consultants. Okay, with that, we're done with the first part of this webinar. We are now going to go into the second part of this webinar, which is how to pre-think assumptions. So what's going to be the agenda of this second part? We're going to look at how you approach CR questions today. Then we're going to look at how to pre-think, and to do that, I'm going to give you 2 arguments. One very simple, one a bit more complex, much more representative of what the kind of argument you're likely to see on the GMAT. And the idea over there is to build that foundation of pre-thinking. Then we're going to actually do not 2, but for this session we're going to do 3 full-length questions, and we're going to do them as a quiz, which means you're going to do them one after the other. And then we're going to do a detailed review of those questions. We're going to apply pre-thinking. We're also going to apply the negation test. And then post this, we're going to look at how should you be approaching pre-thinking. What should be your should-be approach? And I'll also tell you where you can get more practice. So at a very high level, we'll document how you prepare today. Then we'll look at the pre-thinking approach, and then we'll look at how can you master pre-thinking. Now, one thing I want to really say is, even though we'll talk about pre-thinking in the context of assumptions, what this would lay the foundation of how to approach pre-thinking and evaluate questions, as well as how to approach pre-thinking in strengthen, weaken, or paradox or logically complete questions. All right, so let's discuss your current approach to pre-thinking. Let me put in a poll question over here. Hold on. Okay, yes. So I'm going to talk about 2 different methodologies over here. I want you to really tell me which methodology do you follow. But before we do that, I want to define what pre-thinking is. Pre-thinking is thinking one potential assumption in your mind in 15 seconds before you look at answer choices. The 3 items in quotes are really, really important. A lot of people, when they think about pre-thinking, they think about predicting the answer. Pre-thinking is not predicting the answer. We're not trying to predict the answer. The whole intent behind pre-thinking is to make sure that we understand the logic of the argument. Okay. The second thing is pre-thinking needs to be done before you look at the answer choices. The moment you start looking at answer choices provide additional information, and that additional information pollutes our mind, and that actually confuses us. So it has to be done purely on the argument. Once you start looking at answer choices, you can throw pre-thinking out of the window. And once you become a skilled pre-thinker, and if you've read the argument properly, should be able to pre-think in 15 seconds or fewer. And that's what my goal would be, to really say, hey, By the end of this webinar, you should have this framework, which as you continue to apply would get you to this 15 seconds time frame in about 5 days. And one thing I want to really say is this is pre-thinking as a term is a fairly old term. It existed in 2004 as well, which is when I studied for the GMAT. But at most places, what you're going to find is that pre-thinking is equated with predicting the answer. I want to make sure that that's not what we are trying to do. We are not trying to predict what the answer choices would have. Pre-thinking is purely thinking of one potential assumption, one of the possible correct answers, but not that correct answer may not be there in the list of answer choices that you see. Okay, so how do you solve assumption questions? There are two methodologies to solve assumption questions. I want you to tell me which methodology do you follow today. All right, I have upwards of 200 students here in the webinar. Let's get a few more responses. The question is, which methodology do you follow today? Do you read the argument? Do you go to the answer choices and do this back and forth between the argument and the answer choices, do this back and forth till you get to the right answer? Or the second methodology is that you read the argument, you actually then go to the answer choices and then only come back if you have a doubt, which means you may come back just once during this entire cycle. So based on the responses over here, what I really see is that about 55% of the class follows what we call as a pre-thinking assumption or a pre-thinking approach, and about 45% of the class follows methodology one, which is the back and forth approach. Now my goal really would be those who follow methodology one, I would want to give them a taste of what pre-thinking looks like and to really tell them how to effectively do pre-thinking. Those who follow methodology two, I want to get you guys further along this journey of pre-thinking and make you more efficient pre-thinkers. Okay, if you are someone who does do pre-thinking, I want to understand where do you spend the biggest or a majority of your time or the biggest chunk of your time, if it's even if it's not a majority. And there are three steps in which you could spend the time. It's only for people who follow the pre-thinking approach. Three, two, and one. Let me end the poll, broadcast the results. And what you really see is 75% of you who've responded spend a majority of the time in reading and understanding the argument. That's kind of where you would be spending time if you follow the pre-thinking approach. If you follow the other approach, you would spend a majority of the time in still evaluating the answer choices. Why? Because you'll have to do a lot more back and forth. But if you follow the pre-thinking approach, this is where you'd be spending the biggest chunk of your time. Okay, with that, we're going to really understand what an assumption is, and to really do that, I'm going to present a very simple argument to you. Okay, let me actually put in a poll question where and what I want you to do over here is I want you to tell me what does the author assume here, or what is the assumption. Okay, very simple argument. I'm going to remove broadcast results. So you guys will type your answers and you won't be able to see what others have typed or even what you've typed till I select broadcast results. But if you type and press enter, your results will be stored over here. I promise that. So here is Okay, I have 68 answers, 70 answers. In about 5 seconds, I'm going to start broadcasting the answers. 2, 1. Let me start broadcasting the answers. You guys can, I'll give you about 20-25 seconds to go through it. Most of the answers that I see over here are pretty decent answers. They do tell me that you understand the logic of the argument. Now, the reason why I have this question, it's a very simple argument, some of the simpler arguments that you're going to really see out there, is to really tell you that pre-thinking is a natural process. It is easy if you understand the argument. On the other hand, if you don't understand the argument, you're going to find that pre-thinking starts to become very difficult. So that's why uh, we need to spend time to understand the argument so that pre-thinking starts to become a natural process. So one of the key things required to pre-think successfully is to be able to understand the argument. So what's over here? You say, in the first line, what the author gives is he gives you a data point. He says there's a guy called Joe, and this guy scored 500 on the GMAT. And then based on this data point, the author makes a prediction. He says, therefore, he will not get admission into a specific type of college called an Ivy League college. Okay, so essentially data point here and conclusion here. And then there's a jump from this data point to the conclusion. Now, while making that jump, the author makes a certain assumption. What is that assumption? That a score of 500 on the GMAT for someone like Joe is unacceptable to Ivy League colleges. Now, many of you got this unacceptability part. You say, hey, 500 is too low. Ivy League colleges do not admit folks with a score of 500 or lower. But what many of you missed, and some of you actually got it, but many of you missed is that this assumption has to pertain just to Joe, because what the author is saying is that Joe will not get admission into an Ivy League college. The author is not saying that the Prince of Saudi Arabia will not get admission into Ivy League college. So just something which I want to talk about with regards to CR arguments in general. It's really important to understand what the conclusion is talking about, in this case Ivy League college, and who the conclusion is talking about. And as you do that, you're going to find that your assumptions, your strengtheners, your weakeners, your evaluate statements are going to be very linked to both these aspects of conclusion. Okay, so with that, let's understand what is the definition of an assumption. So can you guys put in what is the definition of an assumption? How do you define assumption? Okay, I have 9 answers. Again, I'll broadcast results when I have about 30 answers or so. All right, I have 30 answers. Let me broadcast results. So something that must be true, something that has to be, someone saying something that has to be inferred based on the conclusion. Someone is saying information that is always true and a missing link between conclusion and premise. Something which, if proven wrong, will lead to collapsing of author's argument. That's a good statement. Uh, if assumption is not true, the argument fails. So I like what I see over here. You guys have a fairly decent understanding of what an argument is, and then consequently what an assumption is. So when you think of the word argument, always think about conclusion. When you're arguing something, you're trying to prove a point. That is your conclusion. And the purpose of of an argument is to further a conclusion, or further a claim, or further a prediction, or so on and so forth. They're all the same fancy words to say the same thing. A prediction, a conclusion, a claim is all the same things. So what does an assumption do? An assumption is something that is essential for that conclusion to hold true. Okay, it's an unstated idea, which means you can't infer it from the factual part of the argument, that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. Okay, and this must be true is an essential part of what an assumption is. Now, when you look at certain texts and literature, you're going to find that an assumption is something that fills the logical gap and all of that. And while that is true, I I like to, and I tend to think of assumption as something that's a defender of the conclusion, that prevents the conclusion from being invalidated. And when you start thinking about assumption in those terms, what starts to happen is it becomes a lot easier for you to think about assumption, and we're going to talk about why that is the case. Okay, but essentially, an assumption has two attributes. One is it's something which is an unstated idea, which means you can't infer that information from the factual part of the argument. Or in other words, an assumption always provides new information. The second thing is that it must be true. It is that essential pillar which keeps the conclusion floating. It must be true for this conclusion to hold true. Um, JK says, does it have to be unstated? Absolutely, JK. So we're going to do the last example that we do in this, or the last exercise question that we do in this webinar will have an answer choice which will satisfy the must be true criteria, but it would still not be the correct answer because it doesn't provide any new information, which means you could infer that information from the factual part of the argument. And that is the question that I'm going to talk about. It's an official question. So yes, both of these are important. Now, 95% of the time, this is all you need to care about. But as questions get difficult, that 5%, you still have to worry about this. And again, these are just stats. Okay, but an assumption has to be an unstated idea, an idea that you cannot infer from the factual part of the argument. And again, I want to stress that. Something that you can't infer from the factual part of the argument. Again, last part is very clear. The correct answer choice will really satisfy both of these attributes. Now, how do you think about assumption? I was alluding to this earlier. So if you were to think about this house as the argument, and if you were to think about the conclusion as this roof over here, then you see this roof, this conclusion is supported by three pillars. Now, these three pillars are what we call as premises. Now, not all of these premises are essential for the roof to stay where it is. Only one of these pillars may be an essential pillar, which means, let's say the central pillar is the essential pillar. So that is your assumption. Okay. These two other pillars, while they make the roof stronger, are non-essential. So these are what we call as strengtheners, but they're not assumptions. So the way I want to make sure that you think about assumption is that savior that prevents this roof or the conclusion from breaking down. And that's what must be true is. Must be true really says that if I'm not true, then the conclusion can no longer hold true, or the conclusion breaks down and if assumption is not there, or the assumption must be true for the conclusion to hold true. And we're going to really understand this in a bit more detail using this very simplistic argument. Okay, so we're going to understand what do we mean by the conclusion breaking down. So again, very simple argument, the same argument that we really said. What does the author conclude? The author concludes that Joe will not get admission into Ivy League college. Why? Because Joe has the score of 500. So what does falsification of conclusion mean? Or how can this conclusion be destroyed? If Joe gets admission into an Ivy League college with a score of 500, then this conclusion can be and will be destroyed because the author would be falsified at that point. Is this clear? That if Joe gets admission with a score of 500, or someone like Joe gets admission with a score of 500, then this conclusion would be falsified. The author can no longer say, hey, Joe will not get admission into an Ivy League college. Okay. So let's see, how does an assumption protect against this from happening? Because that's the role of an assumption. It has to protect against this from happening. Okay. Which is kind of how you also, when you look at an answer choice, figure out whether that's the correct assumption or not. So we're going to look at what we said was the correct choice. We said a score of 500 on the GMAT for someone like Joe is unacceptable to Ivy League colleges. So we have to evaluate whether this statement is a must be true or is this a correct assumption. So what we have to evaluate, we have to really say, hey, will the conclusion break down if this thing is no longer true? Why, if this pillar is not there, will that conclusion break down? So let's kind of see what happens if this is no longer true. And to really say when this is no longer true, what becomes true is a negated instance of this. Okay, if this is no longer true, then its negated instance by definition becomes true. So if you say that this statement is no longer true, then by definition, this statement becomes true. Why? A score of 500 for someone like Joe is acceptable. All we did was use this word unacceptable and we changed it to acceptable to Ivy League colleges. If this happens, then what happens to my conclusion? Does my conclusion break down? Absolutely it does. Why? Because if score of 500 becomes acceptable, then the author cannot say with 100% certainty that Joe will not get admission into Ivy League college. So that's kind of the mental test that we really do. Now, some of you may be thinking, this is a very simple argument. I got to do answer right away. Why are we doing this test for an argument? Yes, for very simple arguments, a lot of it would start to come to you intuitively. Why? Because you can visualize it very easily. But as arguments become more complex, you're going to face challenges. And essentially what I really did over here was I applied the negation test. Okay. Now, some of you may be confused. You say, hey, why do you say that if a statement is not true, then its negated version automatically becomes true? How many of you are wondering that if I say a statement is not true, then its negated version, how can we say that its negated version automatically becomes true? Let's kind of take a look at this. And this is something which you don't see people telling you explicitly. So I'm going to take a statement over here. Okay. Just purely statements and an implication of statement not true. If you go through our inference module, you're also going to really see this over here. Okay. So let's take a look at a statement which says Harvard has the best MBA program. And if I say this statement is not true, if I say that statement is not true, then by definition, what I'm saying is that A, Harvard does not have the best MBA program, or there's an MBA program that is better than Harvard or as good as Harvard. Isn't that true? If I really say that this statement that Harvard is not the best MBA program, if that's not true, by definition, I'm also saying this. There's another corresponding business school that's almost as good as Harvard, or that could actually be better than Harvard. Now let's take a simpler context here. When I say Joe runs faster than David, and if I say this statement isn't true, then what am I saying? In other words, that, hey, John doesn't run faster than David, or David is either as fast or faster than John. So when you really say a statement is not true, by definition, what you're really saying is that its negated version is true. Okay. Scott has this question. He says, Scott says, I've heard that you should stay away from strong words rather to favor words that give some wiggle room. Is that your advice too? He says, for example, stay away from words such as must, always, and so on and so forth. Yes, Scott, if you go from a statistical standpoint, if you stay away from words such as must or always, sorry, my handwriting over here is, or absolute words, what you're going to find is that they are, in 80 to 90% of the cases, answer choices that contain those words are wrong. But remember this, you still have those 10% of the cases where answer choices that contain those words are correct. And again, when you're doing CR, you're not doing stats. Now, this technique comes useful if you have no time to answer a question and you have a minute to really say which answer choices cannot be correct. Yes, their stats do help you. But again, if you take it as universal truth, you're going to find that you're going to make mistakes on questions that you're otherwise capable to solve. Which is the same thing which a lot of people think, hey, being in sentence correction is always wrong. And we wrote an article, and if you Google being black sheep in GMAT sentence correction, you're going to find that article where we found there were many official questions where being was a part of the correct answer choice. So yes, you can get those what we call as hacks, but acing the GMAT is not about mastering the hacks. acing the GMAT is about understanding what the test is about, and logically approaching that. You can have those hacks towards the end of your preparation, and by that time those hacks would come naturally to you. But if you focus on just learning those hacks, what you're going to find is that you don't get that V40 score. So again, were you able to understand must be true, or were you able to understand why the answer choice, the correct assumption, if that is not true, then a conclusion will break down. So essentially, what an assumption is supposed to do is it's supposed to prevent the conclusion from breaking down. Why? Because by definition, it's an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to hold valid. Another very useful part of this is that if it's not the correct assumption, okay, if it's the incorrect answer choice, then what you're going to find is that the negated version of it does not break the conclusion down. And we're going to really look at this over here. Okay. Again, same argument, and one of the answer choices that was submitted over there is a score of 500 is not a good score. That was an assumption that someone said. That was a statement that someone said is an assumption. And let's see if this is a correct assumption. So we're going to go through the same analysis. The statement that we have to evaluate is whether a score of 500 is not a good score. Now say, is that must be true? Will the conclusion become invalid, or will the conclusion be destroyed, or will the conclusion break down if the statement to the left no longer holds true? So what happens if the statement to the left no longer holds true? We just remove this part, and a score of 500. The negated version of this is that a score of 500 becomes a good score. Now, will Joe get admission if a score of 500 becomes a good score? Absolutely not. Why? Because the author is not saying that Joe will not get admission into an Ivy League college because this is, a bad score. All he's saying is Joe scored a certain number over here, and based on that number, that numerical value of that number, he will not get admission into an Ivy League college. You replace this with 700, and the argument will still hold true. Okay, so you can really see why this is not a great answer choice. This is essentially the foundation of what an assumption is. So for the correct answer choice, if you come up with the pre-thinking, what you're going to find is the conclusion breaks down in the presence of the negated version of this answer choice. So when you negate this answer choice, the conclusion will break down. For the incorrect answer choice, and if you're ever confused, if you negate that answer choice and says, what happens when I negate this answer choice? What happens to my conclusion? You're going to find nothing happens. Okay. If you understand this, you'd be able to answer, every assumption question, every evaluate question, and a good number of strengthen as well as weaken questions. And we're gonna work on this particular notion as we move forward. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to give you a couple of arguments, pure arguments. I'm going to give the next argument that you get is going to be a pure argument, and then I'm going to give you a short answer pod in which you're going to put in your pre-thinking. I'll give you ample time to do that. This says 2 minutes over here. I'm going to give you 3 minutes. So don't rush through the argument. Read the argument properly and think about how can you break the conclusion. Okay, and we're going to record your answers in a short answer pod, and then I think we've done enough of this. We're not going to revise any more theory, but we're going to then go through how I go about pre-thinking, and the focus will be on the process. Now, if you understood the stuff till now, this part is going to be very easy to follow along. And as you follow along this, what would happen is that assumptions would start to jump at you. Okay. With that, let's look at some of the best practices that you should do to make sure that you get this right. The first thing is you need to make sure that you can identify the author's conclusion. What is this that the author is trying to prove? Then, and understand this really, really well. I always say read the conclusion at least twice. Visualize the conclusion in your mind, especially if you're someone who's just starting to learn critical reasoning. Understand why the author or how the author is arriving at the conclusion. What's the logic that the author is using? What's the reasoning? And if you already know what an assumption is, so that's something that's easy. Now, some of you would falter, you'd take longer. Why would that happen? I'm going to give you enough time, so I think taking longer is not going to be an issue. But why do you falter? You know, you're yeah, you're used to reading fast and you're not used to focusing on what you comprehend. A few of you worry too much about timing. They're focused to finding the answer rather than asking what role should an assumption play or how can the assumption protect the conclusion. Okay. So if you don't do this, you're going to find that getting to the correct answer becomes a lot easier. Now, I'm going to put in a short answer pod over here in which you can record your pre-thinking. And again, as I said, I'm going to give you ample time to put in your assumption. Remember, you have to figure out, you have to answer the question, what does the author assume? Also, make sure you have a pen and paper ready, okay? Because you will need a pen and paper. I don't want you to just read the argument in your mind. And here is your first argument. I'm going to mute myself. All right, guys, last 10 seconds. Please put those answers in. I have about 48 responses so far. Three, two, and one. Let me end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results. Now, I saw a few of you started putting in your answers at about a minute. So I gave you about 4.5 minutes for this one. It's 4 minutes, 33 seconds to be precise. And a few of you had started putting in your answers at about a minute 45 or so. And they were really, really good answers. I was really, really happy to see that. But then the answers that I've seen later on um, are, are fall in one of three categories. Either they're correct, so some of you put in your answers later on, they've gotten it right, or they basically are harping on the principle that okay, this is a causal argument. I'm trying to express the causality, so I'm going to really just put in a generic statement where you say, hey, there's no alternate cause. And while you've read that somewhere to really say, yes, that's the right way of thinking, and it is the right way of thinking, uh, uh, an answer choice on the GMAT is not going to be so simple to really say there's no other reason for the difference in learning. So that's the second group where you've just put in a principle over there, but you've not really uh, gone further ahead in your thought process to really say, hey, what could that principle, what kind of an answer choice could that principle lead to? And if you've not gone ahead in applying that principle, then there's a good chance that when you see a certain answer choice, you're not going to be able to identify it as a correct answer. The third group of people, which I really see, are those who've actually not even understood the conclusion and have written facts from the argument itself. So let's kind of look at it. So you would know once I address uh, once we go through the pre-thinking approach, you would know which group do you belong to. But I would say about 20% of the class got the assumption spot on, got one of the assumptions spot on, which is really, really good. You guys are doing very good. So let's see how we go about doing this. Uh, Before we do this, what did we talk about? What's the role of an assumption? Let me put in a short answer pod. What is the role of an assumption? If you could tell me. What did we talk about? What is the role of an assumption? Yeah, it ensures that the conclusion holds true. Again, if those of you are really saying a missing link, you are really not defining the assumption properly. Yes, an assumption does provide a missing link, but every statement that provides a missing link is not an assumption. Okay. An assumption, think of it, if you want to really think about an assumption in the manner such that you're able to pre-think properly, think of it as an assumption is what I call as a protector of the conclusion. An assumption is a protector of the conclusion. It prevents the conclusion from faltering. And let me actually see if I can get an eraser over here. Apparently not. I'm going to just have to undo. So an assumption is your protector, with something that protects the conclusion. Okay. So if you think about how to go about finding assumptions, the first thing you have to do is find what that conclusion is saying. Then you need to figure out the logic that the author uses to arrive at the conclusion. And 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 once you've done that, you have to ask this pre-thinking question. And what is that pre-thinking question? Hey, under what circumstances does the conclusion need help? Or under what circumstances will the conclusion break down? Why? Because those are the areas where the conclusion needs protection. When we say an assumption is a statement that must be true, what we are really saying is without the assumption, the conclusion will break down. So in other words, the assumption is protecting the conclusion. Handwriting is bad. Sorry about that. Let's see if this pen works. Up. Okay. So let's see how do we go about doing this. So we need And all of this comes from that definition of conclusion. So what we're really saying is without the assumption, your conclusion will break down, which means your assumption has to be built around those scenarios that in which the conclusion breaks down. Why? Because the assumption is tasked to really prevent the conclusion from breaking down. So to find out what an assumption is, let's figure out those scenarios in which the conclusion does break down. Why? Because that's what the assumption is supposed to prevent from happening. Does that make sense? Yes, no? You can type in your answers. Okay. So the one question that you need to ask, and which is what we call as the falsification method, and this is no rocket science, ask this question: under what circumstances, given the facts in the argument, will the conclusion break down? That's it. As long as you can do this, you should be able to come up with assumptions fairly easily. So now this is your argument. The first thing you have to do is identify which statement is your conclusion. Now I'm going to show you a poll question in which there are 4 answer choices because I use this poll question for another argument. You have to focus on only statements 1 to 3 because this argument only has 3 statements. So you have to tell me which statement do you think is the main conclusion of the argument. Okay, let's get a few more responses. 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll and broadcast the results. 54% of you think statement 2 is the correct conclusion, and you guys are absolutely right. Statement 2 is indeed the correct conclusion. 27% of you actually think statement 1 is the conclusion. And the reason why a lot of people think statement 1 is the main conclusion is because they really see this word concludes over here and they say, hey, this has this word concludes, so it must be the main conclusion. Remember, the main conclusion is always by the author. Statement 1 is just a factual piece of information in which the author really says that there's been a recent paper which was published, and that paper has made this conclusion that tenured professors or those on their way to tenure enhance student learning less than full-time lecturers. But that's not what the author wants you to believe. What the author wants you to believe is that what causes this difference. So clearly is a conclusion marker. When he says the difference between professors in the tenure system and other full-time lecturers has to do with the reward system. What the author wants you to believe is that it's the reward system for the former, for their tenured faculty, that is causing the difference. And then statement number 3 is written to make statement 2 more believable, which is, they say, the criterion for rewarding tenured faculty places a greater emphasis on research than on teaching. Okay. Now I have another poll question. Statement 3. Whose reward system does statement 3 discuss? So this the last statement over here. Does it discuss the reward system for tenured faculty, full-time lecturers, or both? Let's get a few more responses. Okay, 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. Broadcast the results. 85% of you really say it's tenured faculty, and you guys are absolutely correct. Now tell me this. While solving the question, did you have this clarity that statement 3 only discusses the reward system for tenured faculty? Just be very honest. While doing this yourself, did you ask yourself this question? And if you did you have this level of clarity? But 67% of you did. That's very, very good. Okay, so and for those of you, for those 12% of you, or rather I would say about 14% of you who think it's for both or for the other side, This word greater compares the emphasis. It's a comparative word on research than on teaching, but this is only done for tenured faculty. Okay, it's very clear from this statement. Now, what does the author want to prove over here? What does the author want to prove over here? Can you write it down in simple words? No, what can you write down the gist of the conclusion? That the reward system makes the difference. The difference in teaching is because of the reward system. The reward system causes this difference in this enhancement over here. Okay, that's really important. That this reward system is the cause. Okay, so what does the conclusion need protection from? Okay, or what does the assumption need to do? You have to figure out what the assumption needs to do. If you want to really see what does the conclusion need protection from, you have to figure out under what circumstances, given the data or the facts in the argument, will this conclusion break down? Will the author no longer be able to say that the reward system is responsible? Okay. Or under what circumstances will the reward system not be responsible for the difference in performance? Okay. This is the scenario that the conclusion needs protection from. Can everyone see this? If we can come up with scenarios in which reward systems are not responsible, then those scenarios actually break my conclusion down. Okay. So what are some of those scenarios? Let's kind of look at this. Again, you have this entire argument over here. So what are some of those scenarios in which you can't blame the reward system? One of those scenarios is if the other group, if non-tenured faculty has the exact same reward system. Okay. If both the groups have an identical reward system, then you can't blame the reward system. Isn't that true? All right, perfect. Okay. So this is something that the conclusion needs protection from, or this is what we call as falsifying scenarios. Or you can have a reward system, but the reward system for that group, they don't care about the reward system. They don't act as per the reward system. In that case also, you can't blame the reward system. Okay, can you really see that? All right, perfect. So and there are a couple of others as well, but this is about thinking about it. So if these are the scenarios in which the conclusion breaks down, then what are my assumptions? That now non-tenured faculty does not have an identical reward system, or most tenured professors should care about the reward system. Either one of these is a correct assumption. Now, for those of you who are saying alternate cause, what you really see is if you saw any one of these statements, you would not be able to relate them to alternate cause. Why? Because it's not your classical alternate cause. Because there is no cause. What it's saying is the given cause by itself is not impactful. And that's where it's really important to not just be limited to a principle, but to get into the guts of the argument, to understand what we call as the logical structure of the argument, and really come up with these falsification scenarios. Because if you understand those, coming up with assumption becomes fairly easy. Okay. But one thing that I want to make sure you understand is that when you ask this pre-thinking question methodically, falsification scenarios start to come up really easily. Now we're going to do another question. I'm going to give you a full-length question over here, and then I have some of these other pieces when I share the PDF that you guys can really look at. Okay. Yes. So Arzu says, this process might take a lot of time. Will we have this much time? Great question, Ars. I always get this question in the webinar. As you get accustomed to pre-thinking, and I'm going to really show this over here. Actually, it's probably there in the next set of slides only. So let's talk about pre-thinking and timing. By the way, if you want to learn negation tests, this is probably the most comprehensive work ever done on how to negate statements. So how would you feel when it comes to pre-thinking? Okay, so let's say you're someone who's starting at this point number one, where your accuracy, so on the y-axis you see this is accuracy, on easy, medium, and on is low, medium, or high, and then this is the time to answer questions. So the moment you start doing pre-thinking, two things will happen. Your accuracy will improve and your time to answer questions will go up. And most people who are at this point over here, who need help in critical reasoning questions, worry more about time, and they don't really congratulate that increase in accuracy. And what you're going to really say is, why the hell am I worrying about this approach? Because it seems that it is going to take longer, and it will initially. Initially, it will. At that point, I want to make sure that you keep faith. You continue practicing this approach. And as you continue doing that, you're going to find two things. One is your accuracy continues to improve. The second is your time to answer questions. That time goes down, and it goes actually, you start answering questions a lot faster. And then you say, now I understand why do we pre-think. And the reason why this is going to happen over here is because, a lot of these steps, understanding the conclusion, defining that logical structure, and creating that falsification question would start to become a natural process for you. And then as you continue to do that, you're going to find that, you continue to improve a whole lot more, and you start doing this. The average time to answer a CR question gets to about a minute 40 or so. And by the way, you're able to do really difficult questions in CR. And that's when you're going to really say, okay, this is really, really good. I can now use CR as a strength to save time on CR and spend more time on RC or SC if that's where you need more time. Preetham says, does this process work for other CR question types? Yes, every CR question is run through pre-thinking. In fact, we rarely transport this method to reading comprehension as well. Now, we do have a few e-GMAT, and I understand many of you are have just started learning. We are really in the very, very first part of the CR course. But essentially, we call this a level 1, level 2, level 3 pre-thinker. So if you are an e-GMAT student, tell me, which level are you currently in? Three. If you are an e-GMAT student who has already started learning assumptions, I think that's really, really important for me to say. So here's the data over here, and the thing which is there is most of these people over here right now have just started with assumptions, and you already see that a few have already gone to level 3, which is good. But the beauty of this is many have gone to level 2, and which is really, really good for me as well, because if you've gone to level 3, you're going through a natural process of the journey. Weber says, I face this issue where I pre-think a certain assumption and then go to the solution based on that and compare my answers. But more often than not, the answer is dealing with another assumption, but now I don't have enough time to go back and rethink the other assumption. So Weber, I think what you're doing is something very wrong here. In pre-thinking, you're only supposed to think of one assumption. But when you read the answer choices, you're not doing a pattern recognition to really say, is this identical to what I thought? But what you're really doing is you're still reading that answer choice and really saying, does this break the conclusion? And that's something that you need to do. Now, doing that should be very easy if you've come up with one assumption accurately. Okay. Remember, going through the answer choices is not pattern recognition. It is you're still applying the logic, but you already know that logic, so doing that is fairly easy. Okay, couple of questions. Is POE required in POE is required in all GMAT questions because you have 5 answer choices and only one of them is correct. Ashwin says sometimes I'm not able to do pre-thinking. Can I go with the negation technique? I would say you can, but if you can't do pre-thinking, you're going to be hard pressed to apply the negation technique. That's something that I can tell you from experience because essentially both of them require that you understand the logic of the argument. Arindam says, how many assumptions do you need to come up with during a time-tested atmosphere? Arindam, in the beginning, we really said the process of pre-thinking requires that you come up with only one assumption. Only one. That's all I care about. Okay. One thing which I want to make sure you understand is pre-thinking. A lot of people use pre-thinking as a hammer for every problem, and forget the intent of pre-thinking. The intent of pre-thinking is that you understand the logic that the author is trying to really say, and this is a litmus test that ensures that you've understood that logic, um, and that's something which is really important. Okay, so let's pick the pace up, and I'm going to show you certain instances of people who've done this, and you can go and read this. Here's a student who really said, um, someone who scored a 740. He said, understand the passage completely, take your time. Equally important, pre-think and answer before looking at the answer choice. Probably this one word will have the most impact on your GMAT score. By the way, this guy's debrief, if you really want to understand how do you plan your attempt, probably one of the best debriefs out there. He just he's used math to solve the problem of timing so beautifully that I think a lot of us could learn from it. There's another guy who says this pre-thinking primes the mind. We are constantly on our toes while reading an RC paragraph or a CR question stem. Apart from comprehending the passage, we keep speculating that in which direction the passage will orient or what logical jump has the author taken. Okay. This is a guy who actually went from 520 to 740. Uh, so now we're going to solve an official question. It's called highway miles. And it's a classical question in the sense that, hey, if you use pre-thinking in this question, you're going to find that the answer jumps right at you. If you do not use pre-thinking, you're going to be confused between many answer choices. So let's just uh, do this. I'm going to give you about 3.5 minutes, fairly simple argument. So take a stab at it. All right, get those answers in last 15 seconds, guys. 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results. So what do we see over here? We see um, two answer choices being very popular, choices B and E. And then we have C, D are also quite popular. Choice A not as popular. Now, the reason why I have this argument over here, or this question over here, it's an official question as well, um, or rather, it's the first official question that you've seen here in this webinar so far. The reason why I have this question is because this question has three strengtheners and one correct assumption. So your correct answer choice is choice E, and I'm going to discuss why that's the correct answer choice. But choices B, C, and D, all of them are strengtheners, and they're correct strengtheners. So unless and until you apply that precise definition of assumption, you won't be able to rule out B, C, and D, and you won't be able to commit choice E. So what's going on in this argument? There's something which is going on, and where what we are saying is there's a highway commission, and they're considering a 50% increase in the toll, and the current toll is at 10 cents per mile. And what the highway commissioner is saying is by increasing this, we're going to increase the annual revenue generated by the toll highway by at least 50%. So he says, I'm going to increase the toll by 50%, and by doing that, my annual revenue is going to go up by at least 50%. Very, very simple argument overall. Okay. So then my question really is, how do you estimate annual revenue? What's the formula for annual revenue? Let me put in an open-ended question over here. The generic short answer question type. So how do you estimate annual revenue? Okay, Niharika has a great answer. It says, hey, toll times distance. So okay, toll per mile times the distance traveled. Really, really good. So the way to estimate annual revenue is you toll per mile multiplied by the total number of miles that are traveled. Now, what do we already know? In this equation, what do we already know? The toll per mile is already up by 50%. Right? It's already up by 50%. And what is the claim? That this is going to go up at least by 50%. Okay, this is going to go up at least by 50%. So what's the only thing that needs to be true? What is the only thing that needs to be true? Let me put in clear all answers so you guys can type your answers in. If the conclusion is that this is going to go up by at least 50%, and we know this part is already up by 50%, then the total number of miles must either remain the same or go up, or it should not come down. The distance should not come down. It can go up, okay, or it can remain the same, but it should not come down. It cannot go down. This cannot happen. Okay. Pre-thinking, very, very simple over here. Let's do a generic yes, no. Everyone understands this? Great. Again, we go through this. Total number of miles decreases. Assumption is the total number of miles that does not decrease. Now here are the answer choices. Let's look at choice B. Choice B was a very popular choice. So choice C is the correct answer. We know that. Why? Because it talks about total distance by vehicles on the toll highway. It talks about the total number of miles. So you can really see why that is the correct answer. But many of you have still chosen choice B. And let's kind of look at choice B. And we're going to look at that in detail. And if you understand why choice B is wrong, you're going to understand why choices C and D are wrong as well. So choice B says the total number of trips made on toll highway per year will not decrease from its current level. So you see this is choice B. I have said that over here. So the question to ask is, if it does happen, if you negate this answer choice, if it does happen, does it mean that the total number of miles traveled on toll roads will decrease? If we have fewer trips, does it mean that? Does it necessarily imply that? No. As someone said, average distance might increase, so the conclusion can still hold true. Or the conclusion doesn't break down, as Akash Dixit has said, in the presence of the negated version of the answer choice. Okay. And because of this, we can really say this is not my correct assumption. And again, as I said, the question to ask is this statement must be true? Is it required for the conclusion to hold true? Uh, 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 and that's where that focus on conclusion is really, really important. And if you did not frame the pre-thinking question properly, what you're going to find is that that you will get confused with this. Why? Because the conclusion is purely about the total number of miles traveled. Okay. So again, similarly, when you think about Scott says, I do think that there's a bias in this question. Some people have no concept of toll roads. I think, Scott, here is one of the things which is there. If you're going to do an international MBA, then you should have some idea of how the world internationally works. And the world today is way more connected than what it was 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. So I think that you'd find that there are fewer and fewer people, and that's where you practice a whole lot more. I agree there are certain places where you may not have any toll roads, and that's there. But essentially, you know, this is fairly clear uh, with regards to how the problem works. You're paying a toll per mile, and that increases 50%. If you're paying a toll per mile, the total revenue has to be how many miles you traveled multiplied by the toll per mile. So even if you've never been on a toll road, the scenario over here is not as complex. I mean, that's the same thing which, if you go to a business school and post business school, you go to a business that you've never been in, which was the case actually with me. If you understand some of the fundamentals right, you'd still be able to understand what keeps that business ticking. Okay. Now let's solve a few more full-length questions. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you two even more difficult questions. So this was based on the data over here as a group. If the accuracy is lower than 50%, it becomes a 700 level question. Now the questions that I'm gonna talk about over here are gonna be even more difficult. And because these questions are more difficult, I don't want to time this group as a whole. What I want this group to time itself. So what I want you to do is I want you to choose this choice which says not answered. So if you choose this choice not answered, I will know how many people are actually making an attempt at the question. And when 80% of you choose a choice other than not answered, then I will start to call time. Okay. So I'd like to see at least 100 people choose not answered. And and so I want at least 100 people to choose not answered, and you're going to really see the timer as what percentage of the group is done. So I have about, what, 75, 76 people who've made a choice, 77. Let's get at least 100 people. I have 151 students in the class right now. 80, 90, 91, 92, 93, 95. Let's get to 100, guys. We need just 5 more. 96. Yes, 99. Some already answered. Yes, you don't know whether that answer is correct or not, but yes, all right. So I have 100 responses here. Here is your poll question. Good luck, guys. Or here's your actual argument. Good luck, guys. Okay, guys, let's get to the next question. About 80% of the class is done. So I'm going to give you guys 15 seconds to put in your answers. 90% is done right now. 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results. And what we see over here is choices A and D are very popular. B and D are kind of popular as well. Choice E is not popular. And one thing that I would say is that, some of you saying that, hey, if you're someone who's just started learning arguments or critical reasoning, you're going to find this difficult. Why? Because for the last 30 minutes, we've been in a fairly advanced aspect of critical reasoning. If you've not gone through the foundation files, it is going to feel difficult. But as long as you understood the first part of the argument A, and B, as long as you're able to follow once I present the solution, you're golden. But make sure that you go through the foundation files after that. It'll really help you see through these solutions, understand this method a lot more. Okay, so this was the first question. Let me put in our second question as well. We're going to do both these questions one after the other. So again, I want you guys to select not done, not answered. I want to see 100 people select not answered so that I can show the next question. '89, 90, 93. Let's see, 96. Let's get four more and you can then see the question. 99, 100. Perfect. Let me remove broadcast results. And here is your question. Good luck, guys. All right, guys, get those answers in. 85% of you are already done. 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. So both of these questions were difficult questions. They're probably the most challenging assumption questions you're going to see. So choice for this particular question, choice D is the most popular choice, but choices C and E are also very popular. So these are the last two questions that we're going to do over here today. Yeah, they are all 7. Both of them are 700 level questions. In fact, the last 3 questions that we've done are 700 level questions. So, excuse me. So let's kind of look at this. This particular question, RDS technology, is probably the most challenging question, one of the most challenging arguments you're going to really see. Now, the logic in this argument, not super complex, but just this argument uses a lot of a number of terms, and just keeping track of that. And if you're not methodical with regards to writing things down on a pen and paper, you would find that that you do miss the track of this. So, fairly simple argument. What's the conclusion? The conclusion is the number of V's, I tend to really give short names, V's, receiving what? Special program information did not increase significantly during this time period. Now, you guys are talking about hacks. I'm going to really talk about something which is a logical hack. If you look at this conclusion, if you focus just on this conclusion, you're going to observe a few things. And this is something that I expect everyone to really make it a practice. When you look at this, it's this conclusion has a few interesting things. One is it's about Verlanders. Okay, the second is it's about special programs, and the third is it's about what happened during this time period. There are these 3 things which are there in the conclusion. Can you guys all see that, or did you guys see this when you were reading the question? Okay, all right, that is good. So that's what the author is trying to say. That's your main conclusion. Okay, now what does the author really say? That there are 2 things that have happened. One is a number of RDS equipped radios. These are the radios that people have in their houses to receive the programs. They did not change a whole lot in between these 2 years. The second is that the number of transmitting stations, this number seemed to have increased quite a bit between 94 and 96. It in fact increased from 250 to 600. Okay, and then what is the first statement? The first statement is a really important statement. Can you guys summarize the meaning of this first statement? What does this statement say? Can you give me the essence of this? What's the essence of this first statement? Okay. Forget about premise. What people are saying is good. So essentially what this first statement is saying is that you have these transmitting stations, okay? Let's kind of call them transmitting stations. And if a transmission station has RDS technology, and then if you have a radio, let's just make a radio over here with an antenna, nice little antenna. Yeah, so a transmitting station with RDS technology can send the special programs which only a radio with RDS technology can receive. So essentially, what is there over here is that if you want to get this special programming, you need 2 things. You need a transmitting station with RDS technology, and then you need a receiving radio that also has RDS technology. Do you guys get that?
So you need things at both ends. You need the things at the transmitting end as well as the receiving end. Okay, so what's the logical structure? The author really says his conclusion is very few additional Verlanders or V's received a special programs. Why does the author really say that? Because two things happened between 94 and 96. One is the number of radios, you know, the number of radios that people had, they remained almost unchanged. The second is the number of transmitting stations, they actually more than doubled. They went from 250 to 600. And the context is to receive special programming, you need RDS radios as well as RDS equipped transmitting stations. Okay, so we're going to go through the same way. We're going to really say, what's the falsification question? The conclusion is very few additional Verlanders receive special programming. Now, the falsification question is, under what scenario or under what conditions will there be a significant addition to the number of people receiving special programming, given that there are very few additional radios that people have, and given that there are a lot more transmitting stations that happened between 94 and 96. So, what are the scenarios in which I can break this conclusion down? How can I break this conclusion down? Can you guys come up with certain scenarios? Let's see some answers in the short answer pod. Okay, it says who says in there are two scenarios, and I'll tell you who's really said that. Marcelin has said if there are more people per radio, and that's a great scenario. And then someone talked about coverage as well. Christine talked about coverage. That's really, really good as well. And then a few other folks who are really saying the same thing. But these were the two guys who said this up front. Really, really good. So what are the possible scenarios? If the additional stations, these stations that increase a lot, now cover areas where people had the radio, but there was no coverage earlier. So if we increase the coverage area, or if the people per radio increases, which means if we start putting these radios in Starbucks, so people, more and more people are listening to these radios. So what are my assumptions? If these are the scenarios in which the conclusion breaks down, then my assumption really is that the new stations did not increase the coverage a whole lot, or people per radio remain about the same. Is everyone clear with these assumptions? If you have the right kind of radio, yes. Again, received. Remember this. Who has this question over here? Again, please put that question, Anish, in the Q&A pod. The conclusion is received. And Abhishek says, again, please do not put the question in the Q&A pod. Okay, I would prefer not to answer those questions because it pollutes the data, and I'm someone who's very, very particular about data. Okay, so let's bring in the poll question over here. Here are my answer choices. This is how you guys responded. Choice A was 30%, choice D was 31%, and choice B and C were also quite popular. So let's kind of look at this and say which choice is our must be true choice, which choice has to be true for the conclusion to hold true. And what is my conclusion? The number of Erlanders receiving special programming, did not increase a whole lot between 94 and 96. Choice A is the choice that is my correct choice, and it's a fairly complex choice. So let's kind of look at it and what this choice is saying. Choice A says few, if any, which means almost none. Few, if any, means almost none of the RDS radio stations that began broadcasting after 1994. So this, I just want to increase the underline. Okay, broadcast to people with RDS equipped radios living in areas not previously reached by RDS stationing. A fairly very complex answer choice, but what this answer choice is saying is few, if any, is almost none. Which are the RDS stations that broadcast after that began broadcasting after 1994? These are the new radio stations. Broadcast to people with the right kind of radius but were living in areas which were not previously reached. What does this mean? Increasing the coverage. So what the author is really saying is that almost none of the new radio stations increase the coverage of RDS programming. Okay, so this is, first of all, when you look at this, this was in line with one of the pre-thinkings that we had, right? Okay, but if you also want to put the negation test to it, the negated version of this is that at least some radio stations increase coverage. And if at least some radio stations increase coverage, then can the author really say with 100% certainty that there's no significant addition in the number of Verlanders receiving special program information? No, the author can't say, which means my conclusion breaks apart. So this is my correct answer, which is choice A. 30% of you got this right, and that's wonderful. But we're going to go through each and every answer choice in this as well. We're going to really go through it in really good detail. Choice B was very popular. Now remember, what's an assumption? It's something that must be true for the conclusion to hold true. So whenever you have to evaluate an answer choice, you have to read that answer choice and really first understand what that choice is saying. Choice B says in 1996, most Verlanders, which means the majority of Verlanders, which means let's say most, let's put a number as 70%. Now most is anything which is higher than 50%. So let's say it is saying 70% of Verlanders who lived within the listening area of an RDS station already had a radio equipped to receive RDS. Okay, so my question to you is it necessary for the conclusion to hold true that most of the Verlanders should have an RDS equipped radio? Is that required? No, it is not required. Even if 15%, sorry, let me just try and write down 15%, terrible. Let me actually put in a text box here. If 15% had the RDS radio in 94 and 15% had it in 96, the conclusion will still hold true. So it's not required that that majority of the Verlanders or most Verlanders who lived within the listening area in 94 or 96 had an RDS equipped radio. Okay, so that's why this is wrong. Again, it's important to understand what the conclusion is about. RDS technologies, here are the poll answers over here. Now let's look at the next answer choice. Next answer choice, again, popular. A lot of people really said that. It says, what happens when you equip a radio station with RDS technology? Okay. Now, do you care about what happens if you equip a radio station with RDS technology? Isn't RDS technology required to broadcast special programming? RDS technology is something that you need as per the argument to do special programming. So we don't care what happens to a radio station when you equip it with this special technology. Why? Because what is the range of special programming if a radio station does not have RDS technology? Let me ask the question again. What is the range of special programming The answer is zero, nil. It is essentially zero, because if you need RDS technology to broadcast special programming, then without it, the range is zero. So this answer choice by itself, if you understand the argument, is irrelevant. Why? Because you need RDS technology. Okay. Now, choice D, the most popular choice but incorrect. It says in 1996, let's kind of look at this choice. In 1996, were landers who did not own radios equipped to receive RDS. First of all, do we care about people who do not have the right radios? No, we don't. Why? Because you need the right radio to receive RDS programming. Could not receive any programming. Do we care about any programming, guys, or do we care about special programming? What do we care about in the conclusion? We only care about special programming. Okay, so because we don't care about people who don't own the right kind of radios, or we don't care about any programming, this answer choice is wrong. Type of programming, again, I don't really care. So you can really see, even though this question was very confusing, um, the correct answer was the answer choice which was correct was the only answer choice that addressed the must be true scenario. Okay, Shelby will refuse. Let me get in your poll question. Here is how people responded to this question. Choice D, yes. Yes, choice D, it's the operating word there was any programming, and that's what gave it away. Also, as per the argument, it's also looking at people who did not own the right kind of radio. So let's see who's put in that question. Vipin, please put the question in the Q&A pod. So even if in choice D over here, let's just go back over here. Let's go to choice D before we go to Shelby will refuse, because this is a good doubt. So in choice D, even if instead of any programming, if it said special programming, would we have cared about it? No, not really. Why? Because as per the argument, this is it would have provided information that's already given as per the argument. There is no information here. Why? Because if as per the argument, if you do not own an RDS radio, you can't receive any special programming. Does that help, Vipin? So both reasons are important here, this as well as this. Vipin? Yes, the option would be wrong since it doesn't provide any new information. It's not it goes against the fact, no, but it doesn't provide any new information. If instead of any programming over here in this choice, it said special programming, then this information is already given in the argument. There's no new information. Okay, let me just go back. I'm going to do this quickly and then we're going to go to the last question here, guys. So what's the conclusion here? And let me just put in your argument on top so you guys can read the argument. Here's the argument over here, and you may have to scroll through the notes pane if you are on a tiny, if you're watching this using a tiny phone. The conclusion here is between 1994 and 96, the number of people receiving special programming did not increase a whole lot, or it remained about the same. Any doubts here? So under what condition will this conclusion break down? If this number, if there were, let's say, 100 people who were receiving the special programming in 1994, and then now in 1996, that number increases to 150. Okay. And you can really see this question talks about radios. So it has to be a question that is, yeah, we don't care about the number of radios. Yes, Scott, absolutely. That's why one of the answer choices is, let's say the number of radios in 1994 were 50, and we know that this number is still 50. Sorry about this, 50 over here in 96. But if the people per radio go up, then the number of Erlanders receiving special programming does go up, despite the number of radios remaining the same. If we start putting these radios in Starbucks, the number of people will go up. Does that help, Scott? Perfect. And that's what's important here. I'm glad that you're focusing on that conclusion. Okay, guys, let's go to the next question because we have to get done with this session as well. It's already been 2 hours since we've been there. So, Shelby will refuse. So, what is happening over here? I'm going to hide this. You can see the argument up there. So, last year we generated a bunch of garbage, okay? And we did not recycle any. We sent everything for burning. So, let's assume one garbage can over here is equivalent to one truck. So, how many trucks did we send for burning last year? How many trucks did we send for burning, for incineration? Say 10, and there are 10 cans over there. Now this year, what we want to do is we want to reduce the amount of residual ash, and we want to reduce it to half of last year's number. So what we are saying is that if we're going to recycle some of the garbage, and we're going to send the remaining for incineration. Now, if we collect the same amount of garbage this year as we did last year, then how many trucks do you think we're going to send for incineration this year? Half of what it was last year, which is 5. Okay. Now, here is my trick question to you. If instead of collecting the same amount of garbage, if the amount of garbage that we collect this year is 10 times as much, okay, if we collect 10 times as much garbage, then how many trucks do you think will send for incineration this year? If we collect 10 times as much garbage. Let's get a few more responses, guys. Three, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results. So 51% of you say that it's going to be 50 trucks. 26% of you say it's going to be 5 trucks. The correct answer is 5 trucks. So and let's see why we say this is correct. Okay. This year, city services will separate for recycling enough refuse, to reduce the number of truckloads to be incinerated to half of last year's number. So what the author is saying, and that's the beauty of the way it's written over here, is that regardless of how much garbage we collect, I'm only going to send half as many truckloads this year as we did last year. So even if you collect 10 times as much garbage, you're still going to see 5 truckloads of garbage being sent for incinerated. Why? Because we sent 10 truckloads last year. Is that clear, guys? Just read that again. Is that clear? And that's what I want to make sure you understand. That's the picture that needs to be needs to be formed in your brain when you're reading a piece of information. Okay, so if you're going to get 5 truckloads to be incinerated, then what's the only thing that is required to be true for the conclusion to hold true? What's the only thing that's required to be true? What's the only thing that's needed? If you're only going to see 5 truckloads that would be sent for incineration, that the ash per truckload remains the same. Each truck should not generate 10 times as much ash, because if that starts to happen, then we will have a problem. Okay, so let's look at the answer choices here. Again, choice D was the correct answer, and about 40% of you marked choice D. Let's look at the answer choice analysis. Oops, I think wrong question. Just give me 1 second. So let's do the answer choice analysis. So Ankush says, what if we don't have that many recyclable items? Ankush, what generates ash? Incineration of items generates ash, right? Maybe we put everything else in a landfill. Okay, but again, the point really is you have to understand ash is generated only when you burn something. Is that clear, Ankush? Perfect. Okay. Choice A says this year no materials that city services could separate for recycling will be incinerated. Now remember I said early on in the definition of assumption that there will be a question in which a factual piece of information that separates that satisfies the must be true test would be there, but that information, because it's inferred from the argument, will not be the correct answer, and this is that answer choice. This satisfies the must be true. If you do a must be true test and you really say, hey, if if material that's separated for recycling that is incinerated, then it breaks my conclusion down. But then you say, hey, wait a minute, but don't I know this already from the argument? Yes, you can infer this from the argument. And because this doesn't provide any new information, this is not the correct answer, even though it satisfies the must be true test. Okay, let's go to choice B. Choice B talks about cost. Do we care about cost over here, guys? Is the author at all worried about the cost of separating or the cost of anything? No, we don't care about cost in my conclusion. It's out of scope. Choice C talks about the proportion of recyclable material. Now, do we care about the proportion of recyclable material if I'm only going to send half as many trucks? Do I care about that? No. If I'm going to send 5 trucks for incineration, if that number was 10 last year, then I don't care about what happens to the refuse that is not sent. Choice D talks about the ash generated per residual truckload. Okay. So choice D talks about what we talked about. It says it compares the ash generated per truckload last year versus what it was this year. And then it says that it'll be no more, which means it can be the same or it can be less. And it is as per our pre-thinking. You can really say if you negate this statement, the conclusion will break down. Scott, when you say per truckload, the trucks are sent only for incineration as per the argument. So you can assume that these are sent for incineration. And choice E talks about the total quantity of refuse. For the same reason as choice D, this is not the correct answer. Why? Because the total quantity of refuse doesn't matter to us. Why? Because we are only going to send 5 as many truckloads as were sent last year for incineration. So again, this answer choice is wrong as well. And again, you can see the negated part over here. If the negated part is, hey, the total quantity of refuse collected would be greater this year, does it have an impact? No. Why? Because I'm only sending half as many truckloads. Okay. So with that, we've solved 5 arguments in this question, in this session. And what you really saw was that in each one of these arguments, the correct answer was correct and the incorrect answer was absolutely incorrect. There was no notion of, okay, this is a better answer than something else, so that's why we should choose this. No. Uh, in every SCCRRC questions, what you're going to find is the correct answer is the one that's absolutely correct. Everything else doesn't even make sense. Um, so how do you become a CR How do you kind of really get to this? So one thing that I want to make sure you understand is that, hey, this isn't rocket science. What we did was we followed a method and we followed it diligently. As long as we understood the conclusion, as long as we read the information properly, we were able to come up with scenarios in which the conclusion would break down. And once we came up with those scenarios, assumptions jumped right at us. The other thing which is there is once you do this, you didn't have to go back and forth within the argument. So it helps you achieve efficiency. It actually preserves a lot of that mental bandwidth which you need to preserve if you want to go through a 3 hour long test efficiently. Okay, so if you're someone who's not a paid subscriber, then make sure you go through, this is your free trial, you go through the introduction to assumption, pre-thinking logical gap, pre-thinking two entities, okay, and practice those questions over here. We also have a couple of other lessons for you over here, which if you want to get started on boldface, you go through these and it'll give you a much better idea. You'll be in a much better position. On the other hand, if you're a paid student, make sure you go through the entire CR course in a logical fashion. Build the right foundation with the premise and conclusion module, then go through the assumption, the inference module, then assumption, then evaluate, and then so on and so forth. In each of the modules, you will encounter multiple concept files. Each of these files will have a quiz where we'll evaluate you in place. Then you will go through multiple application files and they'll also have a quiz. Then you'll go through practice quizzes and the official questions. And at each point, you will get feedback. Make sure that you make use of that feedback and refine your learning. One of the things that people really say is just tell me which all files should I do every day. If you want to give me a defined study plan, give that to me. And we do not ever do that, even though it's very easy for us to do that. Why? Because different people have may require a different amount of effort. Some people may need to go through a certain set of files twice for them to get the right kind of scores. Others may just breeze through them. So if we really tell you, hey, you need to go through these 3 concept files today, and by the way, you're stuck on the first one, you're going to rush through the other 2, you're not going to do as great a job, and you won't hit that 90th percentile. So for me, what's important really is to really give you feedback that tells you how can you get to that 90th percentile. And we consider you guys to be mature enough to make use of that feedback and modulate your learning accordingly. Now, the thing which is there is, as you go through Scholaranium as well as this course, actually right now there are about 630 full-length practice questions. That's about 4 times as many full-length questions as you're going to find in any official guide. And one thing that I want to make sure you understand is that this is an architecture that's designed to ensure what I call as excellence, not just learning, but excellence. And it's designed to ensure this, which means you get feedback at that conceptual level, you get feedback at that application level, and then you get feedback at qualifying exercise. And if you do well over there, you get to that 90th percentile, which is excellence. If you are a paid student, this is your assumption module. You can see there's a lot more breadth over here. Okay, what you see over here is you start with an introduction to assumption, and then we tell you how to pre-think through various kind of structures of the argument. You go through logical gap, you go through 2 entities, you go through arguments that have segments, you go through arguments that have comparison, you go through quant-related argument. And again, the idea really is one of the key things with regards to learning how to pre-think is to be able to visualize the logic. And each of these argument structures have a slightly different way of visualization. So when you're doing this, you're not just building that foundation for assumption, but you're also learning how to think through arguments, not just for this question type, but also for evaluate, but as well as for strengthen and weaken. And when you do this, you're actually starting to learn application right from file number 3 over here, which is segments. So I call this, and let me just clear my annotations. So the first two files are learning the concepts. Then you have what I call as level 1 application, level 2 application, and the application files. And then you have practice over there. So how do you get to those 100-point score improvements? Apply pre-thinking, learn it diligently. Give yourself time to learn the process. Okay, do the official questions even though you may have done those. And ensure you reach that 80% ability over there. Okay. The other piece is make sure you get the answer right for the right reasons. There's a reason we provide such detailed solutions with, and what do you do in each step, A, B, and C. So this is actually old data. Right now we have about 630 questions in our CR course. So how does this, and these are full length questions, not examples. And how does this compare to some of the other resources over there? You can really see that. And you can see why this leads to that level of perfection. When you go through the CR course, these are the modules that you go through. And which is why we say, hey, do not practice from anywhere else. Do not learn from anywhere else. Why? Because there's no point doing it. And here's an example of a student who improved from V32 to V46. And again, she wasn't someone who was super strong in quant, so she had to make a verbal strong to score a 760. You can watch her video interview over here. But the beauty of this was she attained this improvement in 20 days. She just graduated from ISB. She's now a head of brand. She's someone who worked at Reuters before. She just graduated from ISB. She's now heading branding at a beauty company. So with that, we've come to the end of the second part of this webinar. Then the thing that I want to emphasize over here is that this doesn't require a whole lot of time. It requires a whole lot of diligence, and if you do that, you can do it in actually less than 10 days. With that, we've come to the end of this webinar. I'll be happy to share the PDF with you and answer any questions that have not been answered. Also, it'd be great if you can give me some feedback on the webinar over here. Here's the session handout. All right. And thank you very much for the feedback. I look forward to getting more feedback. Okay, guys. With that, thank you very much, and just make sure that you go through the free trial and do the files. Also, make sure you attend the upcoming free sessions on algebra as well as on how to create your own study plan. Okay, thank you very much, and happy studying, or happy learning rather. Good luck for your GMAT.